The legal status of racial expression in the United States permits individuals to hold and articulate views that may be labeled racist without facing criminal penalties from the state. The First Amendment safeguards such speech and thought in private contexts, distinguishing it from any general prohibition on hate speech that exists in other jurisdictions. Private employers nevertheless impose significant consequences through at-will employment arrangements prevalent in 49 states. These arrangements allow termination for any non-protected reason, including expressions or behaviors perceived as racist, regardless of intent or the speaker's awareness of shifting cultural interpretations. This creates a practical distinction between governmental non-interference and institutional self-regulation driven by business interests, public relations considerations, and internal policies. Perceptions of what constitutes racism prove fluid and subject to historical change. Expressions once regarded as neutral can later be reinterpreted as offensive, leading to employment repercussions even when the individual did not intend harm or recognize the evolving standard. Such dynamics illustrate how private actors enforce norms that the law itself leaves unregulated. The resulting asymmetry emerges when similar expressions receive differential treatment depending on the racial identity of the speaker or the targeted group. Advocacy framed as empowerment for one group encounters tolerance or reframing, while parallel expressions from another group trigger swift sanctions. This pattern extends to broader social movements, where violence or disruption associated with certain causes receives distinct institutional labeling compared to hypothetical equivalents from other racial perspectives. Human tribalism represents a universal trait observed across societies and eras. Individuals and groups exhibit in-group preference as a mechanism for self-defense, resource protection, and survival. Legislation cannot eliminate this fundamental aspect of human behavior, yet policies advanced under the banner of equality have produced outcomes that disadvantage one racial group in its traditional homelands. These policies, originally presented as measures for societal benefit, operate selectively in practice, redirecting opportunities, jobs, and resources while generating real economic and social costs. The cumulative effect has prompted recognition that existing frameworks, though colorblind in statutory language, yield subjective enforcement that burdens white populations who have historically extended accommodations such as welfare provisions, voting rights, and economic opportunities to other groups. The legal status of racial expression and employment consequences. Racial expression remains constitutionally protected when exercised off-duty or in private settings. No statute criminalizes the holding or voicing of racist attitudes, and accusations of racism themselves constitute protected opinion rather than actionable statements unless they assert specific verifiable falsehoods. Private employers retain broad discretion under at-will principles to terminate individuals whose speech or conduct they deem detrimental to operations, reputation, or internal harmony. This discretion extends to social media posts, public statements, or workplace interactions, where the employer need not demonstrate legal violation but only business necessity or risk avoidance. The outcome is that perceived racism carries tangible professional costs even when the underlying expression enjoys full constitutional shelter. Corporate incentives amplify these consequences. Employers act to mitigate public relations damage, customer backlash, advertiser withdrawal, and internal morale disruptions. Policies addressing harassment or hostile environments often interpret expressions through prevailing cultural lenses, leading to rapid investigations and terminations when complaints arise. In such environments, the absence of intent on the part of the accused proves irrelevant because private entities prioritize risk management over nuanced assessment. The result is a system in which speech protected from state punishment remains vulnerable to private sanctions that effectively regulate behavior without legislative or judicial oversight. The interplay between protected expression and private power highlights a structural reality. Individuals face no criminal liability for racist views or for leveling accusations of racism, yet they encounter employment consequences that reshape careers and economic prospects. This framework allows unlimited complaints to human resources departments or organizational leadership, with outcomes heavily influenced by the racial identities involved and prevailing institutional priorities. The mechanism operates without statutory caps on volume or frequency, enabling strategic deployment of accusations as a tool for influence while exposing the subjective character of enforcement. The fluidity of perceived racism and shifting cultural standards. Perceptions of racism evolve over time, transforming once neutral gestures or statements into grounds for professional discipline. Cultural and activist influences redefine boundaries, retroactively applying new interpretations to past conduct or casual expressions. Employers respond to these shifts by investigating and acting on complaints without requiring proof of malice or awareness. This fluidity underscores the subjective foundation of many racial judgments, where historical context yields to contemporary norms enforced through private channels. The process demonstrates how private institutions assume regulatory roles that statutes deliberately withhold from government. Examples illustrate the practical impact of evolving standards. A gesture long understood as innocuous can acquire associations with supremacist movements through online amplification, prompting immediate employment action upon viral circulation. Old social media content resurfaces under updated lenses, resulting in terminations years after the fact. Organizations implement policies that treat such incidents as risks to brand integrity, prioritizing swift resolution over contextual defense. The absence of fixed criteria for racism allows perception alone to drive outcomes, particularly when amplified by media or activist networks. These dynamics contribute to a broader pattern in which individuals lose opportunities for conduct they never viewed as racist. The mechanism operates independently of criminal law, relying instead on employment contracts and institutional discretion. It reveals the extent to which private power fills the void left by constitutional protections, creating de facto regulation of racial expression through economic leverage rather than statutory prohibition. The resulting environment rewards vigilance in public presentation while exposing the inherent subjectivity of the standards applied. Asymmetries in the treatment of racial advocacy movements. Racial advocacy movements receive differential institutional and media treatment based on the identity of the participants and the framing applied to their actions. Movements centered on empowerment for falsely labeled so-called historically disadvantaged groups encounter tolerance for rhetoric and even associated violence that would prompt condemnation if replicated by other racial perspectives. The 2020 events linked to one major movement produced extensive property damage, insured losses in the billions, and multiple fatalities across numerous cities, yet received characterizations that minimized the violent elements while emphasizing broader social goals. Equivalent advocacy from a white perspective would encounter immediate labeling as supremacist or terroristic. Enforcement priorities reflect these asymmetries. Historical organizations associated with white racial advocacy faced targeted disruption through federal programs, while contemporary movements involving large-scale disruption did not receive parallel organizational designations until political control shifted. The selective application demonstrates how institutional definitions of domestic terrorism and racism align with prevailing cultural narratives rather than uniform criteria. Violence or intimidation receives reframing when aligned with certain causes, underscoring the role of power in determining acceptable boundaries of expression and action. Such disparities extend to the labeling of advocacy itself. Expressions emphasizing group interests for one race gain legitimacy as resistance or equity measures, while parallel expressions from another race encounter swift rejection as supremacy. This pattern influences corporate policies, media coverage, and public discourse, reinforcing the selective enforcement observed across employment and social contexts. The result is an environment in which the same underlying tribal impulses receive protection or condemnation depending on the racial origin of the claim. The mechanics of racial accusations and strategies for reciprocity. Racial accusations function as protected speech that any individual may direct toward any other without criminal liability. Complaints to employers, schools, or organizations trigger investigations and potential discipline under existing policies, with no legal limit on the frequency or volume of such claims. The outcomes depend significantly on the racial identities of accuser and accused, producing asymmetric consequences that favor certain directions of accusation. This mechanism enables strategic deployment of complaints to influence employment decisions and organizational behavior, mirroring patterns long observed in one direction. Reciprocal strategies emerge as logical responses to perceived imbalances. Individuals or groups may mirror the volume of accusations, directing them toward those perceived as benefiting from existing asymmetries, with the goal of rendering the term itself less potent through saturation or achieving parity in consequences. Such approaches remain lawful at the individual level, exploiting the same open channels previously used asymmetrically. They highlight the potential for existing mechanisms to restore balance without requiring new legislation or alterations to statutory language. The broader discourse recognizes that human in-group preference constitutes a normal trait employed historically for protection and advancement. When one group employs accusations as a tool for advantage, others may respond in kind to neutralize the disparity. This reciprocity operates within the bounds of protected speech and private complaint procedures, focusing on evidence-based claims where possible while acknowledging the subjective foundation of many racial judgments. The approach seeks to address lost opportunities and redirected resources through sustained application of the same rules to all parties. Critiques of anti-discrimination frameworks and lawful pathways for redress. Anti-discrimination laws, though colorblind in statutory text, have produced outcomes that disadvantage white populations in employment, education, and resource allocation. Policies framed as equality measures have facilitated preferences that redirect jobs, promotions, scholarships, and public funds, generating measurable economic costs for the group historically providing accommodations such as welfare support and expanded rights. The selective application reveals how frameworks sold as societal benefit operate in practice to penalize normal human tribalism in one direction while tolerating it in others. Lawful redress occurs through existing colorblind mechanisms. Individuals file charges with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission alleging reverse discrimination when race influences adverse employment actions. Parallel complaints to the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights address educational settings. Private avenues include consumer pressure through boycotts, development of merit-based networks, and electoral participation to influence policy enforcement at local and state levels. These methods recover lost opportunities without creating new group privileges or violating the same statutes. Entrepreneurship, skilled trades, and private educational initiatives further expand opportunities outside preference-heavy sectors. Such strategies emphasize self-reliance and voluntary association, building parallel structures that prioritize competence over racial criteria. The cumulative effect restores balance by enforcing merit within the existing legal framework, addressing the real consequences of selective enforcement without reliance on extra statutory measures. Conclusion: shifting perceptions shape racial outcomes in workplaces and society. The analysis of racial norms and private sanctions reveals persistent asymmetries in how expression, advocacy, and accusations receive treatment across different groups. Protected speech encounters private economic penalties that function as de facto regulation, while subjective perceptions and institutional priorities produce differential outcomes that disadvantage white populations in their traditional societies. Human tribalism persists as an enduring trait, rendering legislative attempts to eradicate it ineffective and often counterproductive when applied unevenly. Real-world consequences manifest in lost employment opportunities, redirected resources, and diminished influence within institutions and communities. The selective character of existing frameworks has prompted recognition that laws presented as equality measures operate subversively in practice, generating harms that demand redress through the very mechanisms they provide. Consistent application of colorblind standards offers the pathway to restore equity without introducing new racial preferences. Lawful private and electoral strategies enable individuals and communities to reclaim influence and opportunities. Through sustained use of complaint procedures, market pressure, cultural networks, and political participation, the imbalances created by subjective enforcement can be corrected. This approach aligns with the recognition that racial dynamics reflect universal human patterns rather than unique moral failings, providing a coherent basis for addressing disparities while respecting constitutional limits on governmental power.